The Looking Glass, a short story by Anton Chekhov. New Year's Eve. Nellie, the daughter of a landowner and general, a young and pretty girl, dreaming day and night of being married, was sitting in her room, gazing with exhausted, half-closed eyes into the looking glass. She was pale, tense, and as motionless as the looking glass. The non-existent but apparent vista of a long, narrow corridor with endless rows of candles, the reflection of her face, her hands of the frame, all this was already clouded in mist and merged into a boundless grey sea. The sea was undulating, gleaming, and now and then flaring crimson. Looking at Nellie's motionless eyes and parted lips, one could hardly say whether she was asleep or awake, but nevertheless she was seeing. At first she saw only the smile and soft, charming expression of someone's eyes. Then against the shifting grey background there gradually appeared the outlines of a head, a face, eyebrows, beard. It was he, the destined one, the object of long dreams and hopes. The destined one was for Nellie everything, the significance of life, personal happiness, career, fate. Outside him, as on the grey background of the looking glass, all was dark, empty, meaningless. And so it was not strange that, seeing before her a handsome, gently smiling face, she was conscious of bliss, of an unutterably sweet dream that could not be expressed in speech or on paper. Then she heard his voice, saw herself living under the same roof with him, her life merged into his. Months and years flew by against the grey background, and Nellie saw her future distinctly in all its details. Picture followed picture against the grey background. Now Nellie saw herself one winter night knocking at the door of Stepan Lukic, the district doctor. The old dog hoarsely and lazily barked behind the gate. The doctor's windows were in darkness. All was silence. "For God's sake! For God's sake!" whispered Nellie. But at last the garden gate creaked, and Nellie saw the doctor's cook. "Is the doctor at home?" "His honour's asleep," whispered the cook into her sleeve, as though afraid of waking her master. "He's only just got home from his fever patients and gave orders he was not to be waked." But Nellie scarcely heard the cook. Thrusting her aside, she rushed headlong into the doctor's house. Running through some dark and stuffy rooms, upsetting 2 or 3 chairs, she at last reached the doctor's bedroom. Stepan Lukic was lying on his bed, dressed, but without his coat, and with pouting lips was breathing into his open hand. A little nightlight glimmered faintly beside him. Without uttering a word, Nellie sat down and began to cry. She wept bitterly, shaking all over. "My husband is ill!" she sobbed out. Stepan Lukic was silent. He slowly sat up, propped his head on his hand, and looked at his visitor with fixed, sleepy eyes. "My husband is ill," Nellie continued, restraining her sobs. "For mercy's sake, come quickly. Make haste. Make haste." "Eh?" growled the doctor, blowing into his hand. "Come! Come this very minute, or it's terrible to think. For mercy's sake." And pale, exhausted Nellie, gasping and swallowing her tears, began describing to the doctor her husband's illness, her unutterable terror. Her sufferings would have touched the heart of a stone, but the doctor looked at her, blew into his open hand, and not a movement. "I'll come tomorrow," he muttered. "That's impossible," cried Nellie. "I know my husband has typhus. At once. This very minute you are needed." "I have only just come in," muttered the doctor. "For the last 3 days I've been away, seeing typhus patients, and I'm exhausted and ill myself. I simply can't. Absolutely. I've caught it myself. There." And the doctor thrust before her eyes a clinical thermometer. "My temperature is nearly 40. I absolutely can't. I can scarcely sit up. Excuse me. I'll lie down." The doctor lay down. "But I implore you, doctor," Nellie moaned in despair. "I beseech you. Help me for mercy's sake. Make a great effort and come. I will repay you, doctor." "Oh, dear." "Why, I have told you already." "Ah!" Nellie leapt up and walked nervously up and down the bedroom. She longed to explain to the doctor, to bring him to reason. She thought if only he knew how dear her husband was to her and how unhappy she was, he would forget his exhaustion and his illness. But how could she be eloquent enough? "Go to the Zemstvo doctor," she heard Stepan Lukitch's voice. "That's impossible. He lives more than 20 miles from here, and time is precious, and the horses can't stand it. It is 30 miles from us to you, and as much from here to the Zemstvo doctor. No, it's impossible. Come along, Stepan Lukitch. I ask of you an heroic deed. Come, perform that heroic deed. Have pity on us." "It's beyond everything. I'm in a fever. My head's in a whirl, and she won't understand. Leave me alone." "But you are in duty, bound to come. You cannot refuse to come. It's egoism. A man is bound to sacrifice his life for his neighbor, and you refuse to come. I will summon you before the court." Nellie felt that she was uttering a false and undeserved insult, but for her husband's sake, she was capable of forgetting logic, tact, sympathy for others. In reply to her threats, the doctor greedily gulped a glass of cold water. Nellie fell to entreating and imploring like the very lowest beggar. At last, the doctor gave way. He slowly got up, puffing and panting, looking for his coat. "Here it is," cried Nellie, helping him. "Let me put it on to you. Come along. I will repay you. All my life I shall be grateful to you." But what agony! After putting on his coat, the doctor lay down again. Nellie got him up and dragged him to the hall. Then there was an agonizing to-do over his galoshes, his overcoat. His cap was lost. But at last, Nellie was in the carriage with the doctor. Now they had only to drive 30 miles, and her husband would have a doctor's help. The earth was wrapped in darkness. One could not see one's hand before one's face. A cold winter wind was blowing. There were frozen lumps under their wheels. The coachman was continually stopping and wondering which road to take. Nellie and the doctor sat silent all the way. It was fearfully jolting, but they felt neither the cold nor the jolts. "Get on! Get on!" Nellie implored the driver. At 5 in the morning, the exhausted horses drove into the yard. Nellie saw the familiar gates, the well with the crane, the long row of stables and barns. At last, she was at home. "Wait a moment. I will be back directly," she said to Stepan Lukitch, making him sit down on the sofa in the dining room. "Sit still and wait a little, and I'll see how he is going on." On her return from her husband, Nellie found the doctor lying down. He was lying on the sofa and muttering, "Doctor, please! Doctor!" "Eh?" "Ask Domna," muttered Stepan Lukitch. "What?" "They said at the meeting. Vlasov said, 'Who? What?'" And to her horror, Nellie saw that the doctor was as delirious as her husband. What was to be done? "I must go for the Zemstvo doctor," she decided. Then again there followed darkness, a cutting cold wind, lumps of frozen earth. She was suffering in body and in soul, and delusive nature has no arts, no deceptions to compensate these sufferings. Then she saw against the grey background how her husband every spring was in straits for money to pay the interest for the mortgage to the bank. He could not sleep, she could not sleep, and both racked their brains till their heads ached, thinking how to avoid being visited by the clerk of the court. She saw her children, the everlasting apprehension of colds, scarlet fever, diphtheria, bad marks at school, separation. Out of a brood of 5 or 6, one was sure to die. The grey background was not untouched by death. That might well be. A husband and wife cannot die simultaneously. Whatever happened, one must bury the other. And Nellie saw her husband dying. This terrible event presented itself to her in every detail. She saw the coffin, the candles, the deacon, and even the footmarks in the hall made by the undertaker. "Why is it? What is it for?" she asked, looking blankly at her husband's face. And all the previous life with her husband seemed to her a stupid prelude to this. Something fell from Nellie's hand and knocked on the floor. She started, jumped up, and opened her eyes wide. One looking-glass she saw lying at her feet. The other was standing as before on the table. She looked into the looking-glass and saw a pale, tear-stained face. There was no grey background now. "I must have fallen asleep," she thought with a sigh of relief. The Chemist's Wife, a short story by Anton Chekhov. The little town of B, consisting of 2 or 3 crooked streets, was sound asleep. There was a complete stillness in the motionless air. Nothing could be heard but far away, outside the town no doubt, the barking of a dog in a thin, hoarse tenor. It was close upon daybreak. Everything had long been asleep. The only person not asleep was the young wife of Chernomordic, a qualified dispenser who kept a chemist's shop at B. She had gone to bed and got up again 3 times, but could not sleep. She did not know why. She sat at the open window in her nightdress and looked into the street. She felt bored, depressed, vexed. So vexed that she felt quite inclined to cry. Again, she did not know why. There seemed to be a lump in her chest that kept rising into her throat. A few paces behind her, Chernomordic lay curled up close to the wall, snoring sweetly. A greedy flea was stabbing the bridge of his nose, but he did not feel it and was positively smiling, for he was dreaming that everyone in the town had a cough and was buying from him the King of Denmark's cough drops. He could not have been wakened now by pinpricks or by cannon or by caresses. The chemist's shop was almost at the extreme end of the town, so that the chemist's wife could see far into the fields. She could see the eastern horizon growing pale by degrees, then turning crimson as though from a great fire. A big broad-faced moon peeped out unexpectedly from behind bushes in the distance. It was red. As a rule, when the moon emerges from behind bushes, it appears to be blushing. Suddenly, in the stillness of the night, there came the sounds of footsteps and a jingle of spurs. She could hear voices. "That must be the officers going home to the camp from the police captains," thought the chemist's wife. Soon afterwards, 2 figures wearing officers' white tunics came into sight, one big and tall, the other thinner and shorter. They slouched along by the fence, dragging one leg after the other and talking loudly together. As they passed the chemist's shop, they walked more slowly than ever and glanced up at the windows. "It smells like a chemist's," said the thin one. "And so it is. Ah, I remember. I came here last week to buy some castor oil. There's a chemist here with a sour face and the jawbone of an ass. Such a jawbone, my dear fellow. It must have been a jawbone like that Samson killed the Philistines with." "Me, yes," said the big one in a bass voice. "The pharmacist is asleep, and his wife is asleep too. She is a pretty woman, Obtyosov. I saw her. I liked her very much. Tell me, doctor, can she possibly love that jawbone of an ass? Can she?" "No, most likely she does not love him," sighed the doctor, speaking as though he were sorry for the chemist. "The little woman is asleep behind the window, Obtyosov. What? Tossing with the heat, her little mouth half open, and one little foot hanging out of bed. I bet that fool the chemist doesn't realize what a lucky fellow he is. No doubt he sees no difference between a woman and a bottle of carbolic." "I say, doctor," said the officer, stopping, "let us go into the shop and buy something. Perhaps we shall see her." What an idea in the night! What of it? They are obliged to serve one even at night. My dear fellow, let us go in. "If you like." The chemist's wife, hiding behind the curtain, heard a muffled ring. Looking round at her husband, who was smiling and snoring sweetly as before, she threw on her dress, slid her bare feet into her slippers, and ran to the shop. On the other side of the glass door, she could see 2 shadows. The chemist's wife turned up the lamp and hurried to the door to open it, and now she felt neither vexed nor bored nor inclined to cry, though her heart was thumping. The big doctor and the slender Obtyosov walked in. Now she could get a view of them. The doctor was corpulent and swarthy. He wore a beard and was slow in his movements. At the slightest motion, his tunic seemed as though it would crack, and perspiration came onto his face. The officer was rosy, clean-shaven, feminine-looking, and as supple as an English whip. "What may I give you?" asked the chemist's wife, holding her dress across her bosom. "Give us, 4 pennyworth of peppermint lozenges." Without haste, the chemist's wife took down a jar from a shelf and began weighing out lozenges. The customers stared fixedly at her back. The doctor screwed up his eyes like a well-fed cat, while the lieutenant was very grave. "It's the first time I've seen a lady serving in a chemist's shop," observed the doctor. "There's nothing out of the way in it," replied the chemist's wife, looking out of the corner of her eye at the rosy-cheeked officer. "My husband has no assistant, and I always help him." "To be sure. You have a charming little shop. What a number of different jars! And you are not afraid of moving about among the poisons. Brr!" The chemist's wife sealed up the parcel and handed it to the doctor. Obtyosov gave her the money. Half a minute of silence followed. The men exchanged glances, took a step towards the door, then looked at one another again. "Will you give me 2 pennyworth of soda?" said the doctor. Again the chemist's wife slowly and languidly raised her hand to the shelf. "Haven't you in the shop anything, such as," muttered Obtyosov, moving his fingers, "something, so to say, allegorical, revivifying, seltzer water, for instance? Have you any seltzer water?" "Yes," answered the chemist's wife. "Bravo! You're a fairy, not a woman. Give us 3 bottles." The chemist's wife hurriedly sealed up the soda and vanished through the door into the darkness. "A peach," said the doctor with a wink. "You wouldn't find a pineapple like that in the island of Madeira. Eh? What do you say? Do you hear the snoring, though? That's his worship, the chemist, enjoying sweet repose." A minute later, the chemist's wife came back and set 5 bottles on the counter. She had just been in the cellar, and so was flushed and rather excited. "Shh! Quietly," said Obtyosov, when, after uncorking the bottles, she dropped the corkscrew. "Don't make such a noise. You'll wake your husband." "Well, what if I do wake him? He is sleeping so sweetly. He must be dreaming of you. To your health." "Besides," boomed the doctor, hiccuping after the seltzer water, "husbands are such a dull business that it would be very nice of them to be always asleep. How good a drop of red wine would be in this water." "What an idea!" laughed the chemist's wife. "That would be splendid. What a pity they don't sell spirits in chemists' shops, though you ought to sell wine as a medicine. Have you any vinum gallicum rubrum?" "Yes." "Well then, give us some. Bring it here, damn it." "How much do you want?" "Quantum satis. Give us an ounce each in the water, and afterwards we'll see." "Obtyosov, what do you say? First with water, and afterwards per se." The doctor and Obtyosov sat down to the counter, took off their caps, and began drinking the wine. The wine, one must admit, is wretched stuff, vinum nastissimum, though in the presence of, it tastes like nectar. "You are enchanting, madam. In imagination, I kiss your hand." "I would give a great deal to do so, not in imagination," said Obtyosov. "On my honor, I'd give my life." "That's enough," said Madame Chernomordic, flushing and assuming a serious expression. "What a flirt you are, though!" The doctor laughed softly, looking slyly at her from under his brows. "Your eyes seem to be firing shot. Piff-puff. I congratulate you. You've conquered. We are vanquished." The chemist's wife looked at their ruddy faces, listened to their chatter, and soon she, too, grew quite lively. Oh, she felt so gay. She entered into the conversation. She laughed, flirted, and even, after repeated requests from the customers, drank 2 ounces of wine. "You officers ought to come in oftener from the camp," she said. "It's awful how dreary it is here. I'm simply dying of it." "I should think so," said the doctor indignantly. "Such a peach, a miracle of nature, thrown away in the wilds. How well Griboidov said, 'Into the wilds to Saratov.' It's time for us to be off, though. Delighted to have made your acquaintance. Very. How much do we owe you?" The chemist's wife raised her eyes to the ceiling, and her lips moved for some time. 12 rubles 48 kopecks, she said. Obtyosov took out of his pocket a fat pocketbook and, after fumbling for some time among the notes, paid. "Your husband's sleeping sweetly. He must be dreaming," he muttered, pressing her hand at parting. "I don't like to hear silly remarks." "What silly remarks? On the contrary, it's not silly at all. Even Shakespeare said, 'Happy is he who in his youth is young.' Let go of my hand." At last, after much talk, and after kissing the lady's hand at parting, the customers went out of the shop irresolutely, as though they were wondering whether they had not forgotten something. She ran quickly into the bedroom and sat down in the same place. She saw the doctor and the officer, on coming out of the shop, walk lazily away a distance of 20 paces. Then they stopped and began whispering together. What about? Her heart throbbed. There was a pulsing in her temples, and why she did not know. Her heart beat violently, as though those two whispering outside were deciding her fate. 5 minutes later, the doctor parted from Obtyosov and walked on, while Obtyosov came back. He walked past the shop once and a second time. He would stop near the door and then take a few steps again. At last, the bell tinkled discreetly. "What? Who is there?" The chemist's wife heard her husband's voice suddenly. "There's a ring at the bell, and you don't hear it," he said severely. "Is that the way to do things?" He got up, put on his dressing gown, and staggering, half asleep, flopped in his slippers to the shop. "What is it?" he asked Obtyosov. Give me 4 pennyworth of peppermint lozenges." Sniffing continually, yawning, dropping asleep as he moved, and knocking his knees against the counter, the chemist went to the shelf and reached down the jar. 2 minutes later, the chemist's wife saw Obtyosov go out of the shop, and after he had gone some steps, she saw him throw the packet of peppermints on the dusty road. The doctor came from behind a corner to meet him. They met, and gesticulating, vanished in the morning mist. "How unhappy I am," said the chemist's wife, looking angrily at her husband, who was undressing quickly to get into bed again. "Oh, how unhappy I am," she repeated, suddenly melting into bitter tears. "And nobody knows. Nobody knows." "I forgot 4pence on the counter," muttered the chemist, pulling the quilt over him. "Put it away in the till, please." And at once he fell asleep again.